Throughout the history of film, no period has changed the face of cinema as greatly as the French New Wave, a movement in France started by several young filmmakers making innovative and unprecedented films. At the midpoint of the 20th century, this group of directors, through changes in production, story, and technique, were able to reconstruct the pre-existing Hollywood film model to create something entirely new. This exchange of film concepts between France and the United States heavily affected Hollywood productions in the latter half of the 20th century, while the techniques invented can be seen in modern cinema today. During the Second World War, France was under military occupation by the German army. The Nazis banned the showing of any films from the United States. Concurrently, the once great French film industry had diminished into a shallow imitation of its former self. Regardless, for a group of young cinephiles growing up during the occupation, film became a much-needed refuge from the reality of war. Several years later, after their liberation from Germany, the French government was in shambles and owed debts to the several allied nations. In the spring of 1946, the French and United States governments formed the Bloom-Behrens Agreement. Named after the representatives of the two governments, the agreement erased the $2.8 billion debt France owed to the United States. In exchange, French markets were open to various American products, mainly films. It was in this cinematic climate that the French New Wave would begin.
It began as an outgrowth of an attempt to renew culture in France after World War II.
With the French market flooded with American movies, film journals featuring articles about the films and cinema itself became extremely popular. It was at one of these journals, La Cahiers du Cinéma, that many French New Wave directors began their film careers. François Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, Jacques Rivette, and Claude Charbot, or the Young Turks, all joined the journal in their early 20s and had no interest in following any pre-established rules. Many of their articles were written with complete irreverence and detailed what faults they found with current cinema.
They were mostly talking against the kind of films they didn't want and promoting the people they did like.
One of their most important essays, written by Truffaut in 1953, ridiculed the quality of films in France at the time. A tendency of the French cinema showed disdain for the screenwriter and producer-focused productions, predictable, archaic stories, and their sophisticated yet outdated techniques. Whether intentional or not, Truffaut had essentially outlined what the French New Wave would go on to change about cinema. The critics of the New Wave were not content with being critics. They wanted to direct films. However, they did not want to simply be an arm of the production studio. They wanted to be the authors of their own films. This idea was revolutionary at the time. French and U.S. film productions followed a strict hierarchy. The studio chose a producer for the film who would hire a screenwriter to write the script. Beneath these two figures was the director. The Young Turks saw past this and believed it was the director, not the producer or the screenwriter, who was the true creator of the film. Their auteur theory maintained that the director is the author of their films. To get to a point of directing in the current French system, however, they'd have to work for years as an assistant until given the chance to make their mark.
There were a lot of apprentices. People would get a chance to be an apprentice. You go through the film school and you get to be an apprentice, and if you worked your way up slowly, you would get a chance to make a film, but very few did.
The Young Turks were simply too impatient to wait that long. They would have to change the system. Several years earlier, in 1948, the Supreme Court decided on United States v. Paramount Pictures in favor of the United States.
And that put an end to the studio system because it was determined by the Justice Department and the Supreme Court that that was illegal. It was a monopoly.
Influenced by the United States, the French New Wave directors began to finance their films through unconventional methods. Truffaut started a production company with funds from his father-in-law. By bypassing the studio system, directors were able to create their films without any interference from studio heads. Directors were now in charge of their films, while producers and screenwriters answered to them. Simultaneously, camera developments were allowing for films to be shot on location, inexpensively, and without an extensive crew.
A manner of financing films cheaply and figuring out how to shoot them.
With a small crew and no upper management to respond to, these directors were able to tell their own stories like never before. Although it is an overgeneralization to state that cinema in France leading to the French New Wave contained no character-driven stories, those that did told the story of an older, fleeting version of France that these young filmmakers simply could not relate to. Several U.S. films, however, had caught the eyes of these directors. Rebel Without a Cause, directed by Nicholas Ray, details the disconnect between generations.
Nobody talks to children.
No, they just tell them.
While these types of films are rare in the United States, they are recognized by the Young Turks as forerunners of the film industry and precursors for their movement.
To go back further, when I was a lover of films, after the occupation, I was formed by the American cinema.
The Young Turks believed film had a duty to express truth. Based upon the auteur theory, many of the early films were inspired by their own lives and detailed youth culture in France.
Moi, je crois pas du reste que le cinéma influence la jeunesse. Ce qu'il faut essayer, c'est que ça soit plutôt la jeunesse.
These revolutionaries wanted to tell their story and share their philosophies, and they believed the best medium to do it was film.
Where the cinema would become kind of like the equal of the novel and be part of the way that a culture reflects on itself.
Truffaut's directorial debut, and arguably the first truly new wave film, The 400 Blows, is a semi-autobiographical tale of a delinquent in France. It established Truffaut as one of the most humanistic directors of his generation and sets the tone of realism that defines the French New Wave movement.
Et puis je me suis aperçu que ma mère, elle m'aimait pas tellement, elle me disputait toujours, et puis pour rien, des petites affaires insignifiantes.
Soon after, Godard directed his debut Breathless, which focuses on the spontaneity of life during the period. To convey this impulse, Godard would direct with an unfinished script, feeding his actors lines as they filmed. This practice would have been impossible in the classic Hollywood studio system, where a complete script was necessary for production to begin. To tell their stories properly, the French New Wave believed that they would need to rework the language of cinema by altering some techniques or creating entirely new ones. Before the New Wave, films followed a very strict set of filming and editing rules. These rules were deemed essential for the audience to understand the film. Continuity editing, for example, places scenes in chronological order to ensure the film makes sense logically. Establishing shots, medium shots, reaction shots, and close-ups are used to maintain progression throughout the film. Camera placement and editing were meant to be invisible. According to the classical model, the viewers weren't meant to notice the editing as it would impede on the story. While this worked great for Hollywood productions, the Young Turks wanted to be noticed. They loved cinema so greatly they wanted the audience to be aware they were watching a film. This allowed for them to change or completely break the rules of cinema that Hollywood had established. Based partially on necessity and partially on artistic intent, the Young Turks often filmed only one take of each scene using one camera. Therefore, the cinematic space was limited to a single perspective, and they needed to do something new if they wanted to change it. For example, instead of a reaction shot, they would freeze the picture. These innovative techniques of using the camera to tell the story were known as la camera stylo, or literally the camera pen. A companion to the auteur theory, it explains that the camera is the instrument of the director and is used to tell their story. Complementarily, editing during the French New Wave was drastically different from the continuity editing seen in the US at the time. Where US editing was meant to be invisible, French New Wave editing was anything but. The prevalent use of jump cuts in French New Wave films not only changed how individual scenes progressed, but changed the entire pace of the film.
You don't have a linear narrative so that events are following by cause and effect. You don't have visual continuity.
These techniques, while simple in today's light, were groundbreaking at the time. The effects of the French New Wave are impossible to overstate. It fundamentally changed the way films are made in the United States. Starting with the ultra-violent counterculture film Bonnie and Clyde, cinema in the United States went through a similar shift from producer-run studio films to the director-based, independently backed cinema. Independent films now account for approximately 41% of the box office gross, from the virtually 0% before the New Wave. The auteur theory is retained, with directors Quentin Tarantino and Steven Spielberg maintaining a distinct visual style. The subject matter of the films in the early 70s focused much more on gritty realism than the preceding decades. The innovative techniques invented during the period have become standard in today's films. The French New Wave changed American films. Don't believe me? Just watch.